اسمحوا لي أن أقدم لحضراتكم مسير أعمال هذه الجلسة الدكتور سليم تماري. الدكتور سليم تماري كبير الباحثين في مؤسسة الدراسات الفلسطينية ومدير سابق لمؤسسة الدراسات المقدسية التابعة لمؤسسة الدراسات الفلسطينية. الدكتور تماري حاصل على شهادة الدكتوراه في علم الاجتماع من جامعة مانشستر، أستاذ علم الاجتماع في جامعة بيرزيت، وقام بتأليف العديد من الأعمال عن الثقافة الحضرية وعلم الاجتماع السياسي والسيرة الذاتية والتاريخ الاجتماعي لشرق المتوسط. دكتور سليم، المنصة لك، تفضل.
شكرا عزيزي، شكرا على الدعوة. هذه هي الجلسة الثالثة والأخيرة لليوم حول الشعبوية، وسأدير الجلسة التي تشمل 4 مداخلات، أصبحوا الآن 3 بعد غياب زميلنا من تونس الدكتور أنور جمعاوي، وهذا سيعطي المساهمين وقت أطول. جلسة اليوم فيها 4 مداخلات أو 3 بالأحرى. تبدأ بمداخلة للدكتور جين كوين من جامعة كولومبيا بعنوان الشعبوية في السلطة، التهجين وتغيير النظام السياسي، وتليها مداخلة من الأستاذة نادية توربيناتي أيضا من جامعة كولومبيا بعنوان الشعبوية والديمقراطية. ثم تنهي جلسة اليوم الدكتورة هنيدة غانم زميلتنا من مؤسسة مدار بعنوان هل هناك علاقة بين اليمين والشعبوية في إسرائيل؟ وكان من المفروض أن يكون معنا الدكتور أنور جمعاوي، وكانت مداخلته أو التي أرجو أن تحدث ولا أعلم إذا كانت ستقام اليوم أو لا، بعنوان الشعبوية في المشهد السياسي التونسي بعد الثورة، قراءة في التجليات والتداعيات. I will now switch to English to introduce, with great pleasure, to introduce today's 3rd session on populism with a contribution by Dr. Gene Cohen from Columbia University, whose intervention is titled Populism in Power, Hybridization and Regime Change. Dr. Cohen is the Nell and Herbert Singer Professor of Political Thought at Columbia University. She is specialized in contemporary political and legal theory with particular research interests in democratic theory, critical theory, civil society, gender, and the law. Dr. Cohen criticizes the appeal to a populist base as regressive even when issued within the context of left-wing populist radical democracy. I suspect this will be the theme of her talk today. Professor Cohen is the author of numerous articles and books, including Populism and Civil Society, The Challenge to Democratic Constitutionalism. Dr. Cohen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I just need to correct, that's a co-authored book with Andrew Arato, and it's about to appear in November. Okay, our 2nd co-authored book. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and I find it really fascinating to participate in this conference. I only wish I were there. Okay, so I'll start. Unlike fascists, populist parties don't openly aim at regime change. They situate themselves within the democratic imaginary, embrace more or less competitive elections to get into and keep power. But I argue that populism has an authoritarian logic that fosters regime change once populists are in power. I focus on that, and I distinguish between populists in government and populists as the government. Note that populists often mobilize in the name of better, true, or radical democracy, and they criticize democracy deficits that exist in representative democracies, typically blaming liberal dimensions of constitutionalism for them. I reject analyses that locate these deficits in the link of democracy with supposedly alien elements like liberal, Republican, or constitutionalists. I locate the democracy deficit in democracy itself as a permanent possibility in representative political systems whose outcomes depend on institutional design, norms of political behavior, power relations, and the results of struggles over public policy projects and processes. Democratic deficits are not due to the liberal, constitutionalist, or Republican features of modern democracy, features without which democracy is impossible, not just flawed. But they are worsened when either dimension of constitutional democracy is emphasized at the expense of the other. By dimensions, I mean, you could frame this either as limiting and checking as opposed to untrammeled majority rule, or the way the populists do it, liberal constitutionalism against populist sovereignty. Now, to identify and parry the populist challenge, democratic theorists must yet again clarify democracy's symbolic meaning, its normative and empirical presuppositions, and its formal and informal predicates, along with its internal tensions and dynamics. Now, here I can only summarize, of course. This draws on chapter 3 of the forthcoming book. So Lefort argues that democracy is a symbolic order in which the place of power is empty, even regarding its referent of legitimacy, the people. It's a form of society that welcomes indeterminacy as to the basis of power, law, and knowledge. It also involves openness, processes of questioning and contestation. Social division, political plurality, and differentiation are constitutive of democracy. Society is disincorporated. The basis of law, knowledge, and power are differentiated. As Charles Taylor noted, democracy is a teleconcept that involves 3 normative ideals, the normative level now: political equality, political freedom, and self-government under law. What Dahl called the idea of intrinsic equality entails the equal standing of every individual so that no one has a pre-given right to rule. Freedom is also a principle at the core of democracy, and it's entailed in the idea of self-government, living under laws of our own choosing. Now, in modern democracy, this means that elected representatives make collectively binding decisions, in other words, laws, at the pleasure of the citizenry to whom they are supposedly accountable and responsible. What distinguishes democratic from non-democratic regimes are the principles and rules that regulate how the former come to power and norms and practices that hold them accountable. Now, of course, democracy refers to number, the rule of the many, and so majority rule in decision-making, but also the right of the minority to exist in political and civil society. Acceptance of this version of political plurality is inaugurated with democracy so that no single part or party can legitimately claim to embody the whole. Alternation and compromise, maybe alienation too, are principles undergirding the legitimacy of majority rule. There were also informal norms, as we know, of elite behavior for making democracy work, including mutual toleration and institutional forbearance, that's Levitsky and Ziblatt, and refraining from constitutional hardball, that is, refraining from violating the spirit of the Constitution and of democracy by using your legal powers in ways that undermine the opposition and weaken the possibility of cooperation. The 3 formal predicates of democracy that Huck and Ginsburg. Is there a problem? I hear somebody talking. Noted are rights, free and fair elections in which the losing side concedes, and the rule of law. And to this, I would add autonomy of the judiciary and of the state from politicization. Informal predicates of democracy are an autonomous civil society, on which Andrew and I have written, and the practices of counter-democracy. As we argued long ago, the sets of rights, including freedoms of association, speech, media, personal privacy, are constitutive of an independent civil society. So are autonomous social movements, popular movements. these are the main sources of creativity and innovation. I hear somebody speaking in Arabic. I don't know why. Anyway, these are the main. So social movements are the main.
The translation is.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
These are the main sources of innovation. So autonomous social movements are central to democracy.
Cannot hear.
You got muted, Dr.
You're
Cohen.
muted, yeah.
Mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Anyway, so that's civil society. And then the last dimension of democracy is what Rosan Vallon calls counter-democracy, which focuses on diminishing the inevitable gap between norm and reality, and to keep those in power and to force those in power to give reasons for their decisions. Trust is central to democracy, but so is the organization of distrust. So he concentrates on the democratic rather than liberal version, and democratic institutions that organize distrust registers the fact that those whom we elect are never equivalent to the people. Three key counter-democratic institutions he analyzes are the informal powers of oversight, sanction and prevention, and judgment. Oversight entails whistleblowing, vigilance, and evaluation of governmental actors, duplicity or corruption. Prevention pertains to blocking undesirable political decisions through negative publicity and protest, and judgment is oriented towards accountability and exists in the space between legal prosecution and re-election. It involves inquiry, publicity, etc., regarding elite behavior. Okay, so then what is populism? I'll do this very briefly. That's the ideal type of democracy. Populism is a strategy of political mobilization to attain or retain governmental power by an appeal to popular sovereignty, said to be violated by the establishment. It proceeds through the ideologically thin construction of the empty signifier of the people that constructs chains of equivalence among heterogeneous demands and constituencies, relying on whatever available thick ideology it can use as a host, nationalism or socialism or religion or neoliberalism. It involves a symbolic representation of the whole of the people by mobilized part, the embodiment even of this part in a leader with which the population
Dr.
is
Cohen,
meant to identify and is emotionally tied, the construction of a
Dr.
friend-enemy
Cohen,
dichotomy. What? Slow
it's
down?
a bit, yeah, could you please
Okay.
slow down?
Okay, sorry.
Thanks.
The construction of a friend-enemy dichotomy. The enemy is seen as the establishment and whoever is not part of the populist group. And it insists on a strong notion of politics, usually articulated in terms of an unconstrainable constituent power, and it valorizes electoral competition. So let's turn to populism and power. We can now see the political logic impelling populists in government to eviscerate democracy and foster regime change. Populists can't abandon their claims to democratic legitimacy and minimally competitive elections. But the governmental logic of populism is to occupy the empty space of power in the name of the sovereign people embodied in a leader. There are two forms of populism. The first in government and the second as the government. The move to the creation of a new hybrid regime is a serious tendency under the latter. The key is executive power. In presidential systems, a populist executive can coexist with legislatures in the hands of political opponents, Trump, for example, at times. So we have to consider the possibility that populism will be in rather than the government. In parliamentary systems, it can allow a populist party that on its own doesn't have the majority to be part of a coalition in government. Populism is the government when its party controls at the very least, the executive and legislative branches. But a populist party has all governmental power only when it controls the courts and the majority of provincial or state governments, or has instruments that can guarantee the supremacy of the center. What characterizes populism in government is not only the electoral conquest of the executive, but the battle of that branch against the independence of the other branches, the legislature and separation of power systems, the government in federal systems, and the present civil associations. So the logic of populism in government is a process of hybridization, whereby authoritarian practices and norms get mixed into the existing democratic regime, diminishing its quality and distorting its dynamics. You can look at Perazzotti for this. The first step is to undermine the two key meta-norms of mutual toleration and forbearance regarding institutional prerogatives. Populists in government weaken the norm of mutual toleration by portraying the opposition and rival parties as enemies or as part of the corrupt establishment. Populist executives use their institutional prerogatives to the hilt, undermining the norms of institutional forbearance by playing constitutional hardball in their attempts to gain control of all government institutions and powers. The inner logic of populism, based on the claims of embodying the unitary will of the popular sovereign, drives personalistic populist leaders to undermine horizontal accountability,
قاعدتهم وإلغاء أي مساءلة
labeled as liberal. Shall I repeat that?
يمكن تنفيذها.
Okay. So the inner logic of populism, based on claims of embodying the unitary will of the popular sovereign, drives personalistic populist leaders to undermine horizontal accountability labeled liberal. I mean, institutional checks and balances, the separation of powers, the autonomy of independent parliamentary or executive agencies, and of the judiciary. Weakening the freedom and fairness of electoral competition goes with this. A key instrument is what theorists have called discriminatory legalism, the use of law and formal legal authority arbitrarily and discriminatorily to favor supporters, diminish opponents' rights, disempower and silence minorities, and pressure independent media. The tactic undermines another basic prerequisite of democracy, the rule of law, which it allows for democratic engagement without fear or coercion. The obvious goal is to undercut political competition and diminish the possibility of alternation in power. Populist governments seek to skew the electoral playing field in their favor through a variety of techniques, from diminishing turnout to manipulation of the rules. The logic that inevitably leads to this tactic is distinctive compared to other regimes. To populists, elections are at the service of identification, like plebiscites. They're meant to generate acclaim and blind deference to the populist leader instead of assuring accountability based on critical assessment of policies. Hence, the attacks on civil society, plurality, and opposed movements that threaten the identity of the people with the populist leader. How can the people challenge the people? Populists in government pervert the function of counter-democratic institutions. In and out of power, populists distort oversight and vigilance, turning it into compulsive and permanent distrust of political elite and institutions. It turns critical sovereignty and preventive
Sorry
power.
to interrupt.
Yes.
Is there a way to mute the translation except for the people who are listening to it? I think it's disturbing Dr. Cohen's presentation. Well, let's try to live with it.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
So I was saying that populist government pervert every dimension of populists in government try to pervert and distort every dimension of the ideal type of democracy I described, including counter-democracy, by turning distrust, vigilance, and oversight into absolute negativity and twisting the civilian function of judgment into a paranoid paroxysm of accusation and denunciation. Now, once they become the government, populist executives are better equipped to undermine constitutional democracy, even without abolishing elections or outlawing parties. The move from attacks on the other branches to attacks on the state by populists as the government is a sign that the threshold from a democratic to a hybrid regime is being crossed. So we must consider populism as the government on the regime level. This is one major claim. The process of democratic hybridization, as we saw, involves the introducing authoritarian norms, practices, and procedures into a democratic regime with the aim of skewing the electoral playing field, undermining the opposition's ability to compete, and diminishing the existing institutions. Could you go away? Could you go? Sorry, that was Andrew who was doing a call. Oh, God. All right, so when populists are in government, the process of hybridization is piecemeal and slow. But once populists become the government, there's a shift from quantity to quality, and things are speeded up. The question is how long one can speak merely of a lower quality of democracy and partial democratic backsliding instead of wholesale constitutional retrogression, so that the threshold between democracy and the hybrid regime is crossed. I disagree with those who want to situate the regime type populist governments erect as qualified democracies, illiberal or electoral, but I also disagree with those who see populism in government as a subtype of authoritarianism, even competitive authoritarianism. So I argue that populist governments, populists as the government, involve a distinct hybrid regime that welds together elements from democracy and authoritarianism, but is neither one nor the other. Think of a mule. A mule is not a horse and it's not a donkey. It's not a subtype of horses or donkeys, okay? So that's the concept of hybrid, which some of the theorists of competitive authoritarianism kind of obscure. There can be a variety of hybrid regimes, and the populist hybrid differs from others in its genesis and dynamics. But it must also be differentiated from full-scale authoritarian regimes and outright dictatorships. So it's important to reflect on the threshold for regime change from democracy to a hybrid, so we can differentiate between the degradation of the quality of democracy and its demise. How we act regarding these things also depends on this. So they're not one, but two thresholds. One involving the shift to a populist hybrid regime, the other to full authoritarianism, in which the remaining democratic institutions are pure sham. The separation of powers is key, since if populism wants to challenge and reduce the other forms of political plurality, it's from the vantage point of populism as the government that it can do it. Here is the well-documented interest of populism in constitutional politics that is legitimated by populist attacks on the establishment. Depending on the regime type, the strategy includes constitution making or attacks on apex courts, or the use of amendments to accomplish formal or material constitutional changes to ensure cohesive populist power. But even making a new constitution, passing comprehensive amendments, or success in court packing are only formal signposts of the interest in establishing a new hybrid regime. The difference between formal constitutional and regime change is fundamental. Fully replacing one is not the same. Fully replacing a constitution, for example, is not the same as changing the material constitution. This is shown by the survival of formal separation of powers and traditional rights in many populist constitutions, and by the recourse to various alternative avenues of constitutional politics before and after making new constitutions. Aside from court packing and repeated amendments, the statutory bypassing of formal amendments all involve iterated tampering with regime structure. Given the stealth nature of constitutional changes, it's not possible to pinpoint precisely when the threshold is crossed from a populist government that can still be deemed, if minimally democratic, to a new hybrid populist regime. One important sign is when incremental negative changes in three basic predicates of democracy, free and fully competitive elections, rights to speech, association, rule of law, have been substantially altered together, so that democratic constitution is seriously undermined and constitutional retrogression turns into what is a tantamount to regime change. Another important indication is the systematic violation of the norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. When populist governments purge the judiciary, appoint loyalists to head electoral authorities and other key institutions, just as the security apparatuses and the bureaucracy, politicizing them and undermining their autonomy, when they close parliaments, jail thousands of critics, and impose new constitutional rules of the game, like shifting to a presidential regime, I'm thinking of Erdogan, while maintaining elections, the government veers off the map of constitutional democracy. Last but hardly least, the threshold has most likely been crossed to a new hybrid populist regime when the attack on relatively entrenched populist governments against independent courts ends, because this happens only when those courts have entirely lost their independence. Apex courts guard the differentiation and the separation of power, well, both the differentiation and separation of powers, none of which has the right to monopolize speaking in the name of the popular sovereign. As I said earlier, Lafort's concept of the empty space of power as constitutive of democracy precludes any institution or group purporting to embody or incarnate the popular sovereign and to occupy that space under the mantle of democracy. When populists interpret popular sovereignty and the constituent power in terms of incarnation, populists do that, the role of apex courts is to maintain differentiation. So the harm of all of this to democracy should be obvious. Even short of establishing a new hybrid regime, populists try to make the judiciary their pliant tool. Now, the concept of a hybrid regime as a genus, distinct from both democratic and authoritarian regimes, is important because it allows one to get at the specific dynamics and constraints of the particular blend of democratic and authoritarian elements in the specific hybrid subtype, the populist one. And again, it's important to be able to distinguish between deficient democracies. All democracies are in some sense deficient. There are always gaps between norm and reality, and hybrid non-democracies, and to figure out the relative types of resistance and protest that could be constructive in each. I think Andrew Arata will talk about that in his talk. A populist regime is a distinctive hybrid that introduces enough authoritarian features into the democratic context in which it arises that we must deem them to be post-democratic. But populism is still dependent on democratic legitimacy because it evokes the people's sovereignty. They can't easily dispense with elections or vertical accountability, which allows the people to select and acclaim their institutional embodiment, the populist executive. But authoritarian elements intrinsic to populism undermine its democratic legitimacy in three ways. And I'll basically end with this, with one moment on the other threshold. First, populist hybrid regimes, unlike competitive authoritarian variants, are dependent on mobilization in civil society, but try to control it. A risky proposition because unless you're prepared to use real repression and violence towards movements that mobilize against the government, you could be in trouble. Mobilization is Janus face. It could lead to electoral loss and incite even more violence, and thus further undermine democratic legitimacy. Second, populist regimes have a tendency towards monism, despite their acceptance of competitive elections, since only the populist party and leader can incarnate the true people and be really legitimate. So they put pressure on the pluralist elements in political society and have a hard time sustaining cooperative relations with them, since they're basically deemed implicitly the enemy. And third, while populism's thin ideology is more like a mentality in Linz's sense than an ideological belief system, it has two features that distinguish it from elite mentalities that Linz had in mind. I'm talking about Juan Linz's book on authoritarianism and totalitarianism. So first, the elite mentalities he had in mind orient non-populist competitive authoritarian regimes towards pragmatism and civil privatism. Populist executives tend not to be pragmatic, even regarding the desire to stay in power perpetually, because they are less inclined to cooperate with peer groups, given its monism, and its embodiment of representation, its embodiment model of representation. And populist governments seem to prefer cronyism and corruption, whether they're capitalists or socialists, to cooperation with potential allies. Its mobilizational dynamic forces populist executives periodically to appeal to the people, another factor undermining pragmatism. If we add to all this the primacy of politics over law, the evisceration of the rule of law, it becomes clear that the hybrid populist regimes distort democratic constitutionalism in distinctive ways. For the populist leader, law, even higher constitutional law, and the rule of law is always subordinated to the people's will incarnated in the executive. So neither of the version of legality can limit power. Indeed, the quasi-permanence of the constituent power allegedly embodied in populist executive indicates the tendency towards further regime change in the direction of outright authoritarianism and dictatorship. But the populist subtype of hybrid regimes has a strong interest in maintaining democratic legitimacy, even if the logical outcome of both left and right populisms would be a new regime of authoritarian dictatorship. But it's also possible that the opposition forces in civil and political society and those remaining in key institutions, such as courts, the administration, and legislatures, might be able to defeat the populist hybrid and push it in a democratic direction. We'll see what happens in Turkey. It's going to be very interesting. I close with the second threshold issue, the shift, regime change, from a populist hybrid to a full authoritarian dictatorship. A full authoritarian populist-created regime could remain somewhat pluralist and mobilizational or veer towards civil privatism and pragmatism, downplaying ideology. The variety of subtypes of populist-created authoritarianism can be wide, but a sure sign of the shift over to a full authoritarian regime would be the fact that despite all appeals to the populist sovereign, an incumbent party and leader can no longer lose elections. This means the regime has effectively become a single party state. An equally important sign would be the impossibility of serious challenges to the rules and practices, formal and informal, put in place by the populist regime to control, to maintain its control. One final and crucial additional indication that a populist regime has crossed the threshold to full authoritarianism and dictatorship would be the emergence of a dual state, so that violations of the rule of law and the politicization of ordinary legality is institutionalized, and the prerogative power of the executive is supreme and sovereign above any legal jurisdiction, even if some legal rules remain in some domains to facilitate and regulate either crony capitalism or the supposed social economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Cohen. Our second speaker is Professor Nadia Urbinati. I hope she's with us. And Dr. Urbinati is a professor of political theory in the Department of Political Science, also at Columbia University. She co-authored the Columbia University Faculty Seminar on Political and Social Thought and was a co-editor of the academic journal Constellations, an international journal of critical and democratic theory. She is the author of several articles and books, including Me, the People, How Populism Transforms Democracy, published by Harvard University Press. Dr. Urbinati, the floor is yours.
How long should I talk?
25 minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. Practically my presentation goes along with the previous one, with the Jim Cohen's one, because the spirit and the logic is the same. What I would like to do is to connect very simply populism and democracy in one particular aspect, that is the celebration of a myth of sovereignty. I relate populism in this case to not democracy as such, but to representative democracy based on free and repetitive elections, and to constitutional democracy. So when we speak of populism, we should, in my view, always situate populism in today's political life within this kind of democracy, which is not universal and not historically the same, that is important for us to refer to. So this paper thus argues that populism is a celebration of the myth of sovereignty, not even popular sovereignty, but sovereignty of the state through its executive moment of decision-making. Thus, it fails victim of the vertigo of the one that makes it intolerant of political pluralism, particularly once it is in power, and uses conflict as instrumental to its project of people's unification and power's achievement, but does not deem conflict as constitutive of democracy, and it is ready to criticize it, to constrain it when it is in power. Thus, I reach the conclusion of this long paper, and I'm going to write only a small part of it. I reach this conclusion by focusing on populism on the populist form of representation as embodiment. Representation as embodiment is an old category coming to us from the religious tradition, particularly the Catholic one, and it is used in politics when we speak about the president of the republic. The president represents, embodies the entire nation, if we want to say so. But what the populists do is to apply representation as embodiment, not simply in the representative moment of the people in general, but to the political law-making function. And thus, this implies that populism is not simply a form of democracy, but becomes also a form of the state, as also Jim Coyne was saying before. Thus, I see this form of representation as embodiment as a technology of democratic competition used by populists in order to do what? In order to achieve what representative government, to change what representative government has achieved, namely to fill and to overcome the gap that separates representation as an institution from external, from the externality of institution itself. That is the gap that, can you please stop there are many noises, that overcome the gap that instead representation as mandate creates between the elected and the people outside, between the institutions and the extra institutions. What populist leaders wants to do is to close this gap, and thus to unify sovereignty and government, to unify institutions and the people immediately and directly, so as to transform, as I'm going to say, the politics or the democratic expression of politics in the states, a form of possessive acquisition, occupation of the power by the people themselves, since the gap is closed. So I claim at the end, thus, that this solution, in my view, ends up by being worse than the problem it seeks to solve, precisely because populism is preoccupied not so much with the quality of political conflict and democracy, but is preoccupied with the divisions of the people among parties and interests that gap stimulates and creates. So it is preoccupied with overcoming the divisions in the figure of the populist leader, so as to give the people's full power. But in effect, it's not the people who has full power, but that people represented by the leader. So this makes me infer that despite of his intention to give politics back to the people, as Margaret Canavan wrote in one of his masterful pieces on this topic, populism in power, that is not as a movement of opinion outside the institution, populism in power ends up creating a decisionist leader that is not more accountable to the citizens than the establishment against which that leader mobilizes. This is the paradox. And despite asserting the priority of the people over the institutions, it ends up by celebrating the personification of popular sovereignty. And the unification of the institutions with the extra institutions thus is primed to generate a majority in the government that utilizes institutions for its own advantage. Thus, overcoming the independence of the institutions, as Jean Cohen showed before me, and this independence is a criterion also upon which modern constitutionalism and the rule of law has been based. And as populism in power risks promoting corruption and promoting unchecked arbitrary ruling, not only because of the strategy of coalition. This is a political science, a kind of argument, which is very important because empirically, this is what happens. But above all, theoretically speaking and normatively speaking, because it produces this unification and abolition of the gap, separating institutions with the people, thus neutralizing the possibility of judging, controlling, and surveying on the activity of government. So these paradoxical outcomes become comprehensible if we focus on populist representation. Because after all, in contemporary constitutional representative democracy, populism is a fight over representation of the people. And since the people is not an existing entity, the people, meaning not simply the population or the social groups of people, the people is a creation and construction. The fight over the creation and construction of populism is what, of the people, is what qualifies populism within a democratic environment. So populist aim is to, I insist on that, because this is for me is central, is to fill the gap that political representation creates. Political representation as mandate representation, not as embodiment representation, creates between the elected and the people. Yet this gap is an indispensable condition for institutions and procedures to preserve their impersonality and openness, to remain autonomous from any performing agent, including the majority, and to remain a permanent object of control and surveillance by the people. Because of course, if I am one thing with the institutions, I don't have the normative distance enough to control the institution, because I am the institution. And this trick is dangerous for institutions because they can become occupied or even possessed by the agents without the people outside being able to control them. So the gap that representation creates is among the most remarkable aspect of the modern res publica, of what we call representative constitutional democracy today, that it is indispensable, not that it isn't indispensable doesn't mean that it's not open to abuses and corruption, or that it does not facilitate representatives' indifference towards citizens to citizens that are outside of the institutions. Of course, but this weakness of the implementation of representative democracy, these weaknesses, they cannot be solved by the populist strategy, that is, by the providential leader filling the gap. Thus, unless we abolish election as a method for selecting political leaders, we have no choice but to mirror the gap, not to overcome it. So that democracy is always not only imperfect, but always in the process of approaching or approximating the model or the ideal without being so. So democracy becomes a process of continually checking and surveying against the risk that the selected political class will capture state power. That is the most important, vital characteristic of democracy. And for this reason, democracy, conflict, and freedom, they go together, because they allow us to understand the legitimacy and the openness of this permanent system of control we create as citizens in the very moment we operate as citizens, not as a private individual. So populism emerges as a diagnosis and the lamentation of this risk that is present and always in action and cannot be overcome. Otherwise, democracy is going to be overcome. And when populism finally conquers power, its solution are worse than the disease. So that for me is paramount. And I think the idea of the representative gap that materialized in constitutions, written constitutions, in electoral democracies and representative democracy is what gives us the contribution to, first, the humanization, the process of humanization and immanence of sovereignty, which is no longer something outside, but is constructed by us, made political, as an object of contestation and conflict. And second, this process has made representation a name associated with legitimate government, rather than just institutions like others. It is a fundamental institutional representation. It's an institution that gives us the possibility of making a legitimate government. And this was produced through the centuries, beginning with the 17th century at least, and somehow also before, with a dual process. One of the denaturalization and depersonification of the sovereign power, and second, over the redescription of politics as a process that belongs to nobody and consists in making, justifying, remaking laws and decisions. In this permanent process of instituting and making process, this is what modern democracy is about. And we, well, I cannot go on, but I like to conclude because I'm already too long. So, in fine, the populist critique of representative democracy may be well grounded, because of course we have to criticize always the attempt to abuse and mobilize private or special interest against the general interest of the so-called popular sovereign. Of course we should do that, and of course we are legitimate in criticizing existing parties and establishment. The question is not that, because this is part of the democratic game. Yet the solutions that populists deliver is what should attract us. The solutions populists deliver once in power are hardly capable of solving the problems they denounce, particularly the intractable scourge of a corrupt elite or corruptible elite, because they produce exactly the same. Paradoxically, populist solutions are not as radical as their criticism, and therefore they fail to deliver what they promise. They're traditional, after all, in exalting the unity or the myth of the one, which was prior to politics as articulation of conflict and interest. This is because they interpret the failures of representative government through the lenses of a strong decision maker, rather than through the lens of ongoing active citizens' participations, which represents a detour to the myth of the one, the popular one. If state institutions are the structure of political action, it is because they embody the memory of democratic sovereignties, a memory that takes roots outside of the institutions within society. So political groups, civil associations, citizens' assemblies, and movements of contestations have been generative spaces of both ideas and opinions, and of the interactions between the citizens and decision-making institutions. This is the richness we have to rely upon if we want to amend the establishmentarianism that that representative democracy produces instead of closing this gap and creating a strong and unifying sovereign government in the figure of the leader. So I think this is, if we want to pay attention to the critics or the critical moments of our representative system, we have to stress instead of diminish the relevance and the importance of that gap. Although we want to have this gap filled with movements capable of monitoring, controlling, and claiming. So in conclusion, and it's very, very easy in some sense, the populist leader plays the role of reconstruction of authority, and not merely the role of counterpower. There is no counterpower. It was counterpower perhaps while it was still in the opposition. Once in power, reconstruct the authority, and an authority of the state that is capable of absorbing the collective body into his person and his movement and his agenda. So in this sense, populism in power is a form of possessive conception and actualization of politics, which is a violation of the principle of politics to begin with. So thus, in conclusion, I don't think personally that populism is a good strategy for solving the problems that populism brings to the floor, which are real and existing, and they are not minor problems that have to do with corruptions, with the exclusion of citizens from the possibility of having a voice, and so on and so forth. All these problems are, however, solved in a very bad way when populists get into power and present themselves as reconquering the popular power into the states. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Urbinati, for your incisive remarks and for abiding by the time. May I remind you that your interventions are being translated, and if you can keep the tempo so that the interpreters can bring you to our Arab audience. Our third speaker, I'm happy to introduce, is my colleague and friend from Madar, Dr. Hunaida Ghanem, who is a fellow Palestinian sociologist and anthropologist who received her PhD from the Hebrew University with distinction, and for a number of years has been the director of Madar, the Palestinian Forum for Israeli Studies. يسعدني أن أقدم لكم الزميلة الأستاذة هنيدة غانم، مديرة مؤسسة مدار، ومداخلتها تأتي إلينا بعنوان اليمين الجديد والشعبوية في إسرائيل وأثرها على المسألة الفلسطينية. دكتور هنيدة، تفضلي.
شكرا جزيلا أستاذ سليم. أستاذ طبعا ولو شكرا كثير أستاذ سليم. المضبوط، يعني هو الواحد ما بعرف إذا هي الصدفة السيئة طبعا إنه إحنا اليوم بدنا نحكي عن اليمين الشعبوي، اليمين الجديد، خلينا نقول في إسرائيل، تحولات من التحولات الداخلية في إسرائيل، والتحول من اليمين التنقيحي لليمين الجديد وأثره على القضية الفلسطينية. وكل كتابة الورقة هذه اللي هي ضمن مشروع إحنا عم نعمله عن اليمين الجديد فيها زي كأنه نوع من رؤية شوي كانت سوداوية، إنه إحنا عم بنتابع عمل منظمات المجتمع المدني الإسرائيلي اللي يطلق عليه أحيانا المجتمع المدني السيء بلغة أمل جمال، كنوع مختلف عن المجتمع المدني اللي مفروض إنه يدعم القيم الليبرالية وحقوق الإنسان وإلى آخره. في لحظة اللي عم بيتم تتويج عمل هذا المجتمع المدني ومنظمات المجتمع المدني وعلى رأسها NGO مونيتور في إنه تترجم سياسيا بتحويل تصنيف مجموعة من يعني خلينا نقول من أهم منظمات المجتمع المدني الفلسطيني اللي بتشتغل على مسألة حقوق الإنسان، تصنيفها كمنظمات إرهابية. فلما إحنا بدنا نيجي نحكي عن المجتمع اللي خلينا نقول عن اليمين الجديد وعن مؤسسات المجتمع المدني كمان لليمين الجديد، يمكن بطل في حاجة إنه نقول وأثرها على المسألة الفلسطينية، لأنه أثرها على المسألة الفلسطينية زي ما بقولوا في الممارسة هو واضح، هو خبر اليوم، خبر عاجل على كل التلفزيونات والإعلام اللي موجود. بس يمكن بسوى، وعشان هيك أنا يمكن أقل رح أروح على الجانب النظري، ما رح أركز كتير على الجانب النظري لأسئلة نظرية بتتعلق في الصراع ما حول شو يعني الشعبوي وعلاقته باليمين الجديد وإلى آخره. رح أكون أكتر خلينا نقول زي applied sociology، يعني بدي أحاول أوصف الظاهرة، أشوف كيف اشتغل وليش تطور وكيف أنا عم بشوف إنها ممكن تأثر على كيف رح تأثر، كيف عم بتأثر فعليا على المسألة الفلسطينية. طبعا كل حدا بتابع المشهد الإسرائيلي بشوف إنه على الأقل من خلال عقدين بشكل خلينا نقول أكثر من 2000 يمكن في مراحل معينة، لحظات تاريخية اللي كانت فيها انعطافات. 2005 الانفصال عن غزة، ثم 2009 صعود نتنياهو. بنوجد انه في منعطفات كل الوقت اللي فيه هناك خلينا نقول في تصعيد متواتر ومستمر لقوة اليمين وذهابه أكثر نحو اليمين المتطرف اللي تم وضعه مؤخرا تحت، أو حتى في الكتابة الإسرائيلية السوسيولوجية وفي الكتابات اللي تهتم بالموضوع، تحت مسمى اليمين الجديد. هذا اليمين الجديد قبل ما بنت وإيالة شاكيت طبعا قرروا أنه يسمى الحزب اللي لإلهن اليمين الجديد. هذا هو المصطلح الذي درج استخدامه من أجل تمييزه عن اليمين التنقيحي التقليدي الكلاسيكي، اللي راح أحكي شو الفروقات بيناتهم، وهاي الفروقات شو بتقول لنا فلسطينيان. الخطاب الأساسي يتميز خطاب هذا اليمين الجديد اللي هو متعدد بخطاب قومي يركز على البعد اليهودي القومي للهوية، معادي للقيم الليبرالية بشكل كبير، لمؤسسات الدولة القانونية وأجهزتها سواء الشرطة سواء القضاء، ومعادي جدا للنخب الثقافية. والأساس طبعا هو العداء الشرس للفلسطينيين، رفض حل الدولتين أو أشكال أو وظلاله، واعتبار أي حل مع الفلسطيني مبني على حل خلينا نقول مقبول فلسطينيا على الأقل فاتحة لكارثة على الشعب الإسرائيلي طبعا. وهذا اليمين هو اللي دعم وكان الكور اللي بدعم حكومة نتنياهو، والدعم هو متبادل، بمعنى هو يغذي والآخر يغذي، وحوله ومن خلاله تطورت أيضا ظاهرة ما تسمى البيبيزم في إسرائيل في الخطاب الإسرائيلي، بمعنى التحولق حول القائد واعتباره إنه هو يمثل الشعب الحقيقي في مواجهة النخب، اللي هو الشيء النموذجي للخطاب، استراتيجيات الخطاب الشعبوي. طبعا المصطلح اليمين الجديد في إسرائيل يتم استخدامه عادة للتمييز بينه وبين اليمين التقليدي السياسي اللي تميز بتبني فكر يميني اقتصادي ليبرالي علماني وقومي أرض إسرائيلي. وكان طبعا جابوتينسكي هو الممثل أو المؤسس، الأب المؤسس لهذا اليمين، وشكلت حيروت إذا في كلمات يعني مش واضحة أو أنا يعني مصطلحات بس قولوا لي أنا بوضحها، بس أنا معتبرة إنه كلها هذه مفهومة. شكلت حيروت بيته الأول وبقايا هذا اليمين، وهذا الإشي المهم بمثله اليوم ما يسمى بقايا أمراء الليكود اللي كان على رأسهم في مرحلة معينة دان ميريدور، ريوفن ريفلين، بيني بيغن، ليمور لبنات، وأهمهن اليوم هو ساعر. الإشي اللي يعني بيميز كل هذه الجماعة غير إنه أجت من عائلات تاريخيا كانت من العائلات المؤسسة في الصهيونية وفي الجيل اللي أقام الدولة، إنهم هن كمان كلياتهم محسوبين من ناحية إثنية على الفئة الأشكنازية، وهذا عامل بهمنا كتير لأنه رح يصير واحد من العوامل اللي عم تعمل الفرق بين اليمين الجديد أو يتم توظيفها لتعمل فرق بغض النظر إذا هو صحيح ولا مش صحيح بين اليمين الجديد وبين اليمين التقليدي. ومشاهدة المشهد الإسرائيلي بتوضح إنه من خلال 20 سنة اللي مرقوا بشكل كتير أكتر وأساسي في تراجع مستمر لتيار اليمين التقليدي مقابل الصعود المتواتر لتيار اليمين الجديد، اللي كمان اشتغل على من أجل إحكام قبضته على المفاصل الأساسية للدولة اللي اعتبر إنه هي معاقل لليسار الليبرالي. ويمكن في واحد من الكتب اللي كتير بتعبر عن هاي المحاولة خلينا نقول إحكام القبضة على معاقل ما يعتبره اليسار معاقل اليسار، كتاب اللي صدر بيقول لماذا ننتخب اليمين ونحصل على اليسار، بمعنى إنه ليش إحنا مش قادرين، كان الادعاء الأساسي إنه إحنا كيمين مش قادرين نحكم لأنه معاقل السيطرة والحكم ما زالت موجودة في يد اليسار، وبالتالي يجب علينا أن نعمل ضدها. وهي كل علاقة كمان العمل على خلينا نقول قطع رأس النخب اللي هي تعتبر معادية للمشروع اللي بيمثله اليمين الجديد. وكان يمكن أهم ما اشتغلوا عليه في هذا الموضوع هو موضوع ترسيخ وتثبيت إسرائيل كدولة يهودية، وكان هذا وسط عمل دؤوب مستمر متواتر لتهميش أي قيم ليبرالية. وهذا اليمين احنا بنشوف انه ينشط بشكل كتير كبير عبر جمعيات وعبر شخصيات وعبر أعضاء كنيسة ووزراء من أجل تخصيص القضية الفلسطينية ونزع شرعية المقاومة الفلسطينية ومن يتحدث ضد الاحتلال الإسرائيلي محليا ودوليا. وإنما إحنا بنحكي عن إشي اللي هو واسع وكبير، بنحكي عن شخصيات تيارات، بنحكي عن شخصيات، عن أحزاب من خلفيات من ناحية ديموغرافية، من خلفيات إثنية مختلفة، ولكن أيضا من ناحية أخرى من خلفيات أيديولوجية مختلفة. مثلا بتضم أحزاب اللي هي متدينة قومية مثل نعم، البيت اليهودي، عتصمة يهودية، الحردلية اللي هي عبارة عن دمج ما بين الحرديم المتدينين وما بين الحركات القومية. يمكن سموتريتش واحد من اللي بيمثلوها اليوم تدمج بين التشدد الديني الكبير الدين اللي عادة مثلوه الحرديم وبين التشدد القومي اللي عادة مثلوا تيار المبدأ التقليدي. شبيبة التلال اليوم نواتها الميدانية النشطة والأنوية التوراتية وغير الشخصيات والكور اللي موجود ويمثل ظاهرة البيبيزم في داخل الليكود. كمان حركات مجتمع مدني اللي هي بتشكل الذراع الأساسي اللي لها من أجل إنه مراقبة وهندسة الخطاب العام في داخل المجتمع المدني ونزع شرعية ما يراد نزع شرعيته. بنحكي عن حركات مثل انترتسو، مثل أكاديميا مونيتر، مثل NGO مونيتر، مثل جمعية ريجابيم، غير الشخصيات الأكاديمية أخرى، وأيضا صحف إسرائيل هيوم، مكور ريشون، مجلة هشلوح، وقناة 20، ومراكز أبحاث أساسية ومهمة جدا اللي هي بتخرج أجيال، معهد شالم، فورم كوهلت، ميدا، وطبعا جامعة أريئيل اللي هي الحاضنة الفكرية اللي كلياتها تعمل معا من أجل نشر وترويج خطاب اليمين الجديد الإسرائيلي. هلا على خلاف اليمين التقليدي اللي هيمن عليه طابع علماني ليبرالي، وأنا خلوني أوضح. طلعوا أنا عم بحاول أفهم الظاهرة من وجهة، يعني زي ما بيقولوا من كيف هن بيعبروا عن نفسهم، وأنا ما بتبنى هذه خلينا نقول المفاهيم تبعت ليبرالي وعلماني اللي هي بتحكي عنها. بشوف فيها تناقض كبير بين استعماري وبينها. بس على كل اللي اعتبر نفسه علماني ليبرالي واشكنازي متجانس اثنيا وحزبيا، اليمين الجديد مثل ما قلت بتميز بتنوعه الحزبي والاثنين من جهه، ولكن ايضا بنزعه نحو قيم المحافظه من جهه اخرى. يعني يمكن اللي بتابع كتابات جابوتينسكي يعني بنصدم من قديش كان البني آدم هو علماني جدا أكثر من بن غوريون وأكثر من الأحزاب اللي هي كانت تعبر عن مرات الفكر اليساري الاشتراكي بين قوسين في داخل الخطاب الاستعماري. والأهم إنه يرى نفسه هو المدافع، قلعة الدفاع الأساس، حصن الديمقراطية الإسرائيلية. يعني بيعتبر حاله هو رأس الحربة للدفاع عن الديمقراطية الإسرائيلية اللي هي تتقلص تماما لخيار الأكثرية وحكم الأغلبية اليهودية، لأنه هذا هو الموضوع الأساسي. بذات الوقت هو يعادي قيم الليبرالية، حقوق الأقليات، ويعني لما بنحكي عن شيء هايبريد بمفهوم أوربان عن الديمقراطية والديكتاتورية، هذا في نوع من هذا التوجه بالفكر اللي بحكي. يعني إذا كمان بشوية تنظير، يعني هو بيمثل نموذج ممتاز لما أسمته شانتيل موف تناقض الديمقراطية الليبرالية من حيث تحول الخيار الديمقراطي اللي باسمه يتم الحكم لمجرد محصور في خيار الشعب لقمع الأقليات وقمع القيم الليبرالية، وهو بالضبط ما كان وراء سن قوانين أساس مركزية اللي كمان شكلت منعطف وإعادة تشكيل وهندسة للحيز الداخلي في إسرائيل بما يتعلق بالمواطنة، وعلى رأسه طبعا قانون القومية، قانون إسرائيل الدولة القومية للشعب اليهودي. مثلا إذا بدنا نقتبس جادي تاوب هو عالم اجتماع إسرائيلي بيمثل نموذج، يعني أحد منظري اليمين الجديد حول النخب، بيقول إنه ضد النخب باعتبارها نخب ليبرالية معادية للديمقراطية، مشير إلى أن هذه النخب تفضل حقوق الفرد على حقوق المواطن. ويشير مثلا عدد من الباحثين إنه ما يميز هذا اليمين الجديد هو عدم وجود برنامج إيجابي، يعني إنه ما فيش عنده برنامج إيجابي هو المميز الأساسي لليمين الجديد. أنا بديش بس تقول لي قديش وقت، لأني أنا ممكن أخذ ساعة دكتور سليم، يعني أعطيني هيك وقت لما يكون في عندي.
في معك 8 دقائق
بس أوكي. إذا بدي ألخص أهم نقاط أوكي، إذا بدي ألخص أهم نقاط الخلاف عملياً، أو قبل ما أنا ألخص أهم نقاط الخلاف اللي بين اليمين التقليدي وبين اليمين الجديد، بس وأحكي شوية عن شو هي الأسباب اللي خلينا نقول الخلفيات اللي أدت للتحول من اليمين التقليدي لليمين الجديد. يمكن في حدثين أساسيين الاثنين بيرتبطوا ببعض، اللي هو الأول عمليا بذور هذا التحول بانقلاب عام 1977 اللي هو بشكل حتى لو بدنا نحلله من ناحية انقلاب 77 هو المرة الأولى التي يستطيع اليمين الإسرائيلي بقيادة مناحم بيغن في حينه على التغلب على حزب العمل في اللي هو واحد من يعني من أشكال حزب المؤسسين ماباي. هي المرة الأولى اللي اليمين يصعد للحكم، واعتبر بالخطاب الإسرائيلي بمثابة انقلاب، وهو نتج فعليا عن تحالف من يعني معارضين نخبة المؤسسة محسوبة على ماباي. اوكي، هلا لما احنا بنحكي عن تحالف، احنا في لحظة اللي هي very interesting هنا صارت، انه عمليا او من وضع نفسه بمحل ضحايا او مقصيي ماباي. احنا بنحكي عن حيوت حزب اليمين التقليدي، نحن بنحكي عن الشرقيين، نحن بنحكي كمان عن طبقات معينة من مهاجرين جدد كانوا موجودين حلا. بس الحلف الأساسي والمركز اللي راح يأثر كمان على التوجه وعلى النوع وشكل الثقافة اللي راح تتطور لاحقا وتخلق هذه الصراعات اللي بدها تصير بين اليمين التقليدي الكلاسيكي بصيغته جابوتنسكية واليمين الجديد، هي فعليا التحالف اللي صار بين حيروت بقيادة بيغن وبين بين الشرقيين. اوكي، هاي هي اللحظة اللي تحالفوا معا، وخلينا نقول تمردوا، إذا بدنا نقول تمردوا على الأب المؤسس. يعني هي فيها لحظة قتل للأب المؤسس وأخذ دوره، ولكن بعد هذه اللحظة اللي صار فيها هي لحظة قتل الأب المؤسس، في عنا عملية لحظة الصراع بين الأبناء على الورثة اللي بتتطور.
آسف المقاطعة، التحالف بين حيروت ومين؟
والشرقيين.
الشرقيين، نعم.
الشرقيين نتيجة طبعا الخبرة السيئة جدا مع عملية مع الصهيونية بشكل عام، مع عملية جلبهن للبلاد، مع عملية دمجهن، مع عملية إسكانهن في المخيمات المعبرات، مع الظروف اللي كانت موجودة، وتحميل ماباي مسؤولية الظروف والتدهور في الوضع اللي كانوا موجودين فيه. وطبعا وفوق كل هذا التعامل الفوقي بفوقية وبغطرسة اتجاهن ومساعي محي هويتهن. يعني خلينا نقول معهن كل الحق. وإذا بنطلع بديش أفوت كتير بالسبعينات إحنا بنحكي كمان عن الفهود السود، إحنا بنحكي عن تمرد حقيقي موجود بين الشرقيين بين عدة جماعات. الحزب الليكود بهاي اللحظة قدر إنه يستغل هذا الغضب اللي موجود بيناتهم ويعمل التحالف معهم من أجل إسقاط حزب العمل. بمعنى الاحتجاج وما كان سياسي أيديولوجي إنه نحن نضع يدنا مع الليكود لأنه هو يمين. الاحتجاج وضع اليد مع الليكود بقيادة بيغن كان نتيجة الاحتجاج على ماباي وتشكلاته والرغبة في إسقاطه. أوكي، هل هذا ظل هيك؟ لا، هذا كمان تحول لاحقا وصار جزء من الثقافة عند تيارات مختلفة موجودة، وتم إعادة تشكيله وهندسته وخلينا نقول بناء اقتصاد خاص فيه، بحيث إنه تحول لأشكال جديدة من اليمين الشرقي شاس وحدة من تجلياتها اللي هو الحزب الحريدي الشرقي، اللي كمان مرتبط تشكله بالصراع اللي كان موجود مع الأشكناز بس الحريديين. طبعا النقطة المهمة إنه المفارقة إنه نجاح الليكود في 77 بظل مثلا تم في ظل تصعيد المشروع الاستيطاني في الأراضي اللي احتلت عام 1967، حمل معه أيضا بذور أفول حكم اليمين التنقيحي بصيغة الجابوتنسكية الأشكنازية، لأنه فوز هذا اليمين جاء على مثل ما قلنا على خلفية تحالفه مع الهوامش المعارضة لماباي من شرقيين ومحافظين ومهاجرين سكان أطراف اللي تحولوا تدريجيا للقاعدة المركزية للليكود. هلا الأمر الثاني هذه تعتبر خلينا نقول لحظة مفصلية في عملية حمل بذور التحول لاحقا اللي بدها تصير نحو اليمين الجديد. هناك من يرى مثلا إنه اتفاقيات أوسلو واندلاع الانتفاضة الثانية وضعت في داخلها معادلة مهمة، خلينا نقول أعطت دفعة بهذا باتجاه التحول أيضا نحو اليمين الجديد، لأنه اتفاقية أوسلو من جهة معينة حملت أو دعمت الرؤية اللي كانت موجودة بين الإسرائيلية إنه السلام ممكن. هذا ما يسمى تيار السلام أو تيار اللي هو محسوب على حكم حزب العمل. خلينا نتذكر إنه تقريبا آخر حكومة حزب عمل كانت في فترة أوسلو، فترة رابين. من جهة كان في هناك خلينا نقول وعد معين، هلا مش مزبوط، هلا مبني على وهم، هلا هذا موضوع ثاني مختلف تماما. انا بحكي من ناحيه الاجواء، وعد معين انه هناك امل للسلام، بمعنى انه احنا اللي كنا نحكيه انه تعالوا نكون براغماتيين، التيار حزب العمل في التعامل، احنا تيارنا هو اللي عم بنجح، والتيار الثاني اليميني اللي قال لا لازم تكون متشدد والى اخره وارض اسرائيل والى اخره عم بيفشل. ولكن بعد ما يعني انهار خلينا نقول هذا الأمل وانفجرت الانتفاضة الثانية، لأنه واضح تماما إنه يعني what they want to deliver الحجم تبعه لا يتناسب مع المينيموم اللي بده اياه الشعب الفلسطيني. صار في ديناميكية داخلية اللي هي في عملية تحول مستمر من هذا الانقلاب نحو إحلال التكريس محل ما يسمى الأمل. بمعنى إنه شفتوا إحنا قلنا لكم فيش أمل للحل، إحنا قلنا لكم إنه رح تنقلب الأمور رأساً على عقب، بغض النظر على إنه صار فيهم اغتيال لرابين، بغض النظر عن إيش الأشياء العوامل الداخلية، ولكن كأنه حقق نظرة التكريس والتشاؤم اللي حملها اليمين الجديد. طبعاً هذيك الأيام نحن بنحكي عن ظهور تيارات ما بعد الصهيونية، نحن نتحدث عن فتح الأراشيف، نحن نتحدث عن كتابة رواية النكبة بالتسعينات مجددا، نحن نتحدث عن مجموعة من الكتب اللي بلشت تطلع اللي هي يعني ديكونستراكت، تهدم تماما الأسس اللي كانت موجودة ومبنية عليها النظرية الرسمية الصهيونية القومية اتجاه ما حدث بال48 واتجاه المسألة الفلسطينية، وفي إعادة كتابة وإعادة فتح تساؤل، فتح شو بسموها هاي بندورة بس تبعت التاريخ الفلسطيني مش إشي تاني، فتح مجددا. هاي مع الانتفاضة الثانية تم كأنه استعادة اللحظة من قبل اليمين من أجل نزع شرعيتها مجددا يعني خلينا نقول وإطلاق مجموعة من المشاريع اللي تضع على سلم أولوياتها كسر هاي السردية ومراقبتها. يعني إحنا لما بنحكي عن جمعية مثل انترتسو انقامت بال2005، كان واحدة من الأهداف الرئيسية اللي لإلها انترتسو مأخوذة من جملة لكتاب هرتزل اللي هو التنويلاند، إذا أردتم فهذه ليست شو بسموها أسطورة، بمعنى إذا بدكم تحققوا دولة يهودية هذه مش أسطورة بيحكي فيها عن قصته. أخذوا هذه المقولة من أجل استعادة الصهيونية وخطابها بصيغته الأولى وإعادة بثه من جديد. فإحنا بنحكي لما بنحكي عن الشعبوية نحن نتحدث عن جمعية وضعت أمام عينها إنه مراقبة ما يكتب بالجامعات، عمل بحث عن السيلابوس اللي بيتم تعليمه في الجامعات الإسرائيلية، وضع خلينا نقول فضح كل الخطاب اللي يسمى ما أوكي بحاول بس تكونكلود، ومحاربة كل الأكاديميات في الجامعات الإسرائيلية خاصة في العلوم الاجتماع وغيرهن اللي بيحكوا خطاب اللي هو ما بعد صهيوني، وبموازاة عمل مجموعات مثل مثل أنجي أو مونيتور، مثل رجافيم، مثل مجموعات واسعة من شبكة المجتمع المدني اللي حاولت تخلق هيمنة بديلة لأي خطاب يتحدى خطاب الإسرائيلي المؤسس، حتى مش بس المؤسس الموجود، يتحدث مثلا عن الاحتلال، عن خطاب حول 48، عن النكبة، عن إعادة كتابة الهند، نزع شرعيته واعتباره غير شرعي. كم هلا مش يعني كنت بحب اعرض كم من فيديو صغير هيك بس ما فيش وقت مشان بس نعطي فكره عن الحملات اللي تم اقامتها ضد مثلا منظمات اللي اشتغلت على موضوع الاحتلال، مثل بتسالم، مثل يكسرون الصمت، وضع صورهم بالشوارع مع احمر، مندسون الى اخره، اعتبارهم خونه، وبالتالي وضع او خلق هذا مدعوم طبعا من حكومة، من خطاب. عندك وزيرة ثقافة بتقول يجب علينا أن يكون لدينا شو بسموه ولاء في الثقافة، ولاء في اللي بده ياخذ تمويل من الدولة يجب أن يكون لديه تمويل، وبالتالي أي واحد يحكي عن نكبة مثلا يخرج ضد هذا يعني لا يعطى تمويل ويحاسب إلى آخره. في كل هذه الأجواء اللي كانت موجودة تم صياغة وإعادة صياغة خطاب الشعب، أن الشعب يتكون من شغلتين. الشغلة الأولى هو اليهود، الدولة القومية للشعب اليهودي، بس الشعب الحقيقي للدولة القومية للشعب اليهودي هو اللي بيمثل قيم الشعب الأساسية، هو اللي بيمثل روح الشعب، هو عمليا ضحايا يعني هم أبناء المشروع المؤسس اللي كانوا ضحايا يعني وخلينا نقول قتلوا الأب هذا، ولكن هن الورثة الحقيقيين للأب اللي تم قتله. ماذا يقول هذا عن المشروع الفلسطيني؟ باختصار شديد يقول أن إسرائيل انتقلت بمراحل مختلفة لها علاقة بديناميكية المشروع الاستعماري نفسه، بمجتمع المستعمر، بالصراعات الداخلية، بعلاقة الدين والدولة والقومية والإثنية إلى آخره، بعدة مراحل. يمكن بلشت كمشروع قومي استعماري علماني، تحولت بال67 لمشروع أنا بسميه استيطاني قومي، بمعنى أنه الاستيطان يميل أكثر لاستخدام أو للتمحور حول الفكرة الدينية لأرض إسرائيل، وليس فكرة المستعمرة بالمخيال الغربي اللي تم استخدامه ما قبل 48. وداخل هذا وبسبب جدلية العلاقة بين الاستيطان وبين القومية تم الوصول لإسرائيل خلينا نقول في ظل اليمين الجديد اللي هو التركيز والتمحور حول القومية اليهودية والمستوطنة. في هذا المحل نزع الشرعية هي بتكون باتجاهين. الاتجاه الخارجي هو الفلسطيني باعتباره العدو الأبدي غير قابل للاستدماج، وداخليا باتجاه العدو الداخلي كل المؤسسات، المجتمع المدني، الإسرائيلية، الخطاب الأكاديمي، أي حدا اللي هو بيحاول يعطي خطاب مختلف، وتحويل الشعب لهو هدول الجماعة اللي هن جماعة خلينا نقول المختلفة اللي تنضوي تحت اليمين الجديد. ويا ريت كان عندي بس شوية وقت زيادة أحكي عن كيف تحول هذا كمان لما فهمته مجددا كأنه صراع بين الشرقيين وبين الأشكناز. وكلمة أخيرة، اليوم الحكومة اللي موجودة حكومة التغيير هي بالضبط حالة الصراع الداخلي بين اليمين الكلاسيكي بصيغته الجابوتنسكية الذي يمثل الساعر وإلى حد ما رغم تدينه بنت، بعد أن تحولت قيم اليمين إلى القيم التي تلتصق حولها نخب المجتمع الإسرائيلي وبين اليمين الجديد اللي بيمثله نتنياهو. الخطورة في الموضوع أن نتنياهو تحول إلى غول من ناحية دولية، وبالتالي عملية إبقاء هذا اليمين اللي هو موجود على أساس تبني قيم اليمين الأساسية اللي فيش فيها مكان لفلسطين لأنه هو أرض إسرائيلي، يتم بفضل خلينا نقول يتم بفضل الخوف من ما أسسه نتنياهو وخوف من عودته، ولكن هو مشروعه، هذا هو مشروعه.
شكراً.
أمل إني وضحت إيش.
شكرا هنيدة على هذا العرض الممتع. رح يكون لك فرصة لمتابعة الحديث في فترة النقاش اللي لو طولتي أكثر كانت رح تختفي من عنا. شكرا إنك ربطتي النقاش النظري حول الشعبوية بالوضع الإسرائيلي وجبتي لنا لأرض الواقع. بس ما فهمتش كنت تحكي عن علبة بندورة ولا بندورة؟
بندورة، بس أنا عشان فلسطينية عشان أصلا مش موجودين كشعب في والبيعنا نفس الشيء.
Exactly.
بندورة خيار كله بس بندورة.
I want to thank Hunaida for bringing the discussion into the Israeli scene and linking the theoretical work of the two previous speakers to the local situation. I'm going to open the discussion for interventions from the audience, but before that, I want to make two short remarks trying to bring the earlier discussion with a general framing. The general framing has to do with the use of populism as an overarching concept to discuss contemporary politics in many countries. And this is not my field, so this may be a naive remark, but I'll make it anyway. In the previous session, as well as in this, I noticed the use of populism as a framing device for a large number of contemporary politics, which includes mass mobilization, use of media as an instrument of mobilization, demagogy, and so on. And this makes it so wide that its ability as a sharp instrumental device of interpretation becomes blunted. In other words, how do you prevent from falling into a situation where all modern politics becomes populist, which has features of the systems that you're describing? How do you keep the term populism as a useful device to describe certain regimes but not others? And I want to refer to a key sentence mentioned by Professor Cohen, Gene Cohen, which says, populist hybrid regimes can morph into full authoritarianism, where elections can no longer be lost and are a sham, and the prerogative state takes over. Now, this recalls actually a large number of situations that we have experienced in the Arab world, especially the Ba'athist regime in Iraq and Syria, the Libyan regime under the Jamahiriya, the regime of Bourguiba in Tunis, and maybe Nasserism to some degree. The question is, how do you explain a situation where this did not happen? The Tunisian example actually is a very interesting, exceptional form of Arab politics. Some people will contest that it is exceptional, but it certainly stands alone following the Arab Spring in a situation where populist politics actually sustained democratic forms which were able to withstand both demagogy and an attempted coup d'etat takeover. How do you explain this kind of exception? So rather than have you respond to this immediately, I will invite people to speak from the floor. And if not, then I can read some of your interventions from the panel. Nahed, can you help me? How shall we proceed? What do you suggest? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, so we already have Lana and Andrew who have raised their hands, and Darsheen as well. We can start with those.
Okay, so
Lana, you wanted to
we will take two speakers from the screen, and then I will read two more from the panelists. So we start with Lana Shhadi. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Salim. Actually, my question is for Dr. Arado and Dr. Cohen. Throughout this conference, one of the questions that keeps roaming my mind is this idea of the connection between populism and democracy, especially because we see the example of Turkey. And I think Dr. Cohen really hones in on this when she illustrates the importance of creating a threshold for democratic governments, and really showing a clear difference between the threshold between a democracy and an authoritarian regime. So really looking at Turkey as an example, and looking at the long history Turkey's had as what we would call a democratic government, how do democratic governments prevent the rise of populist leaders or prevent this crossing this threshold? And what characteristics within a government need to exist? Is it strong civil societies? Is it strong political institutions? I just wanted your opinion on that.
Yeah, I was supposed to be second. So I will leave
Go ahead.
the answers to Professor Cohen. I just want to say from my point of view that our definition of populism could not be abused quite in the same way that the chair suggests. And I think one could identify popular politics in lots of places which are not populist. And indeed, one could identify a lot of authoritarian regimes that do not even start as populist, like Pinochet's dictatorship and so on. So I think we can make a distinction. What I'm more interested is that the panelists coming from other countries start relating the issue to your place. I mean, to me, it's a very exciting challenge to confront your very complicated territorial political realities. And it is an issue whether the term populism can help in that. I think that in two respects it can, and I'll leave it to you. First of all, your political existence is a divided one. I don't even know what to call the territory. Should I call it Palestine? Should I call it Israel? Should I call it Holy Land, which might be the best, except that it's religious? So you're in a bifurcated reality, even by name. Secondly, I agree with the previous speaker that in Israel, one can speak about some kind of liberal democracy historically, although it was quite illiberal from the beginning, from some points of view. Nevertheless, and this is something that someone said yesterday, Zionism is not simply a right-wing populist nationalist movement. It was a highly heterogeneous one historically, having a left wing and a right wing. And what is interesting, as the previous speaker told us, is that the shift is toward the right. And this means that in Israel, the concept of what Professor Cohen explained as a hybrid regime is relevant. And it has, as the previous speaker explained, some roots in a populist right, That's them. Now about you, I think that one cannot speak in spite of the PA of you being under your own government. Only very partially is that the case. But you certainly have a Palestinian civil society, and you certainly have movements and initiatives. And I think in your case, the question will be how within those initiatives you can negotiate the inevitable gap of the presence of both populist and popular projects. And if you can manage that, then perhaps the question will be a little easier to solve of how one negotiates the gap between a populist government on one side and on the other side, a popular movement for self-emancipation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Am I unmuted?
I'm going to invite you, Dr. Cohen, but let me just ask that باستطاعة الحاضرين أن يسألوا باللغة العربية والأجوبة رح تترجم فما تترددوا باستعمال اللغة. I'm just saying that if people want to use their own language.
Am I muted or unmuted?
We hear you.
You can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, very good. Okay, yes. So where did she go? The person who asked the question. Oh, there you are. Lana, I thought I'll get to your question. I also wanted to say that it was said very quickly one would have to study it, which means you all should read the book, but the concept of an ideal type of populism, the problem was to avoid a too minimalist and a too maximalist definition or construction, of course. But I think that we did attempt to construct an ideal type which would allow for it to apply to a variety of populisms, but be differentiated from other kinds of regimes, authoritarianisms and democracies that are not populist. That's always a conceptual dilemma. But there's not going to be a simple definition. The same problem comes up with defining fascism or really anything, socialism. How many versions of socialism were there? So I think that one has to do that. One cannot avoid constructing an ideal type concept. And of course, there is a distinction, if you mentioned Tunisia, about which you are much more of an expert than I am, but between popular demonstrations, movements, civil society, all of this, and populism. So I would suggest that if there was a success, and there was initially with democratization and the movement, then the movement itself wasn't populist in the way that we are speaking. Anyway, to get to Lana's question, of course, it's enormous. How do you prevent it? I think there's a really interesting article on Turkey right now in today's New York Times. It's fascinating because as we've seen, Turkey to me is a sort of just at the cusp of shifting to, it is a hybrid regime. However, we think elections can still be lost, we will see. What's fascinating is that there have been efforts, successful in Czech, it used to be Czech, the Czech Republic, trying in Hungary, and now in Turkey for the opposition, which despite all the perversions, distortions, restrictions of rights in Turkey, throwing tens of thousands of people in jail even, still are able to organize and mobilize and to attempt to come together to get rid of Erdogan and then to change back to a parliamentary form of presidential system. That would be tremendous. So the answers about how to, well, in this case, respond and prevent a shift, a full-scale shift into authoritarianism, well, it's going to depend on the constellation of forces, but certainly putting aside your differences and creating what used to be called like a popular front, creating a system of alliances so that you can actually defeat this guy through his own means would be absolutely crucial. Who knows if it will work? We have a different kind of, or we have a different kind of problem in the United States because, of course, it's a two-party system, and the Republicans, unfortunately, now are far more united than Democrats. But hopefully, I don't know. They've been playing rather stupid games because I don't think they understand the risk. They can unite. So on the level of elite party political potential alternative government behavior, it's absolutely crucial, I think, to denounce every single time one of the norms of democracy is violated, every single time that, and to use the Lord of the hilt. I mean, I think, well, I mean, at least prosecuting some of this, revealing the counter-democratic denunciations of all the trespasses of democratic norms, procedures, processes, principles by other elites. You must not tolerate it. You have to call it out and attempt to block it. Because the minute you go along with this, the minute you turn your nose and don't understand the seriousness of the threat, it becomes more and more dangerous. So I think, you know, of course, in Turkey right now, that's what has to be done. The elite with their supporters. But again, I don't know enough about Turkey. I don't know about how much he, I mean, there are other forces. I mean, I doubt that he controls the whole army, for example, but a lot would depend on the constellation of forces. But I do think that it's very important to distinguish between a democratic regime, and they are all deficient. Although they can be more deficient than less. I mean, you can have a shift towards a quasi-oligarchical situation where the opposition is so, where the attempts to disempower others become so extreme. Trump tried to do that, that you trigger populist responses. Because of I mean, populism is always possible given the gap between norm and reality, but it doesn't always emerge. You have to account for at what moments, why does it emerge and when? Why is it emerging now all over the world? Well, I mean, we try to actually address this in our book, looking at economic issues, status concerns, representation issues. So that's a long, that's an analysis. It's a discussion, but I think that I also agree with Nadia that when populists emerge and criticize representational deficiencies or social injustice or articulate clear anxieties about loss of status, and they're real, they matter, then it's incumbent on Democrats to respond to this and take these concerns up in non-polarized ways, because the way populists do is always through what's called effective polarization. Turn a friend-enemy dynamic. They blame the politics of resentment. They never blame the real sources of the problem, whether they're structural and political flaws. They blame what are they called? Scapegoats. They do scapegoating, as we know. So I think that, civil society actors must mobilize and learn and political parties. That's one of the most crucial, because political parties have to recognize the challenge and get down there on the actual level of where the voters are locally and organize. And I suspect that's what's been done in Turkey, although I don't read Turkish, I don't really know, but I suspect that's what's been done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Dr. Urbinati, can you do it in 4 minutes?
Oh, yes. I mean, I was so generous before. Now a few minutes, and a few minutes are, so of course, I mean, both in books and articles I wrote in the last years, this issue most important is separation, distinction between the domain of opinion formations and thus movements and the domain of state administrations or government. This is crucial, otherwise everything is populism. So that we have the paradox that the Brexit was a populist, any kinds of oppositional movement become a populist. No, we need to separate the movements and the strategic power of within the institution. This is also important for another reason, because the tropes of populism are two distinct ones. One is the antagonism against the establishment. This is a kind of engine of all populist rhetoric. And you can have it also in a horizontal movements, you know, the Indignados, Occupy Wall Street, many kinds of movements, they have this dualism, them and we. But this is not enough to make populism. You need to have another trope to make it, another instrument. It's not simply against or excluding others, but unifying those who are similar against the others in order to have a project of technological project of government constructions or majority conquest. For this reason, that second one, the unification, not only against, but unifying those who are against under one leader or a strategy of power or a movement or a party, this is crucial. So otherwise everything is populist and everything is, so we need to make this distinction, in my view. The other things to be said in relation to that is to base populism always historically and within the specific context. So the populists of the 19th century or the populists of moments in which situations were not yet democratic is very different from populists which develops inside of constitutional representative democracy or in moments of transition from one regime to another one. So the definition needs to be careful in defining limits and borders of the definition and not to expand it to everything. So in this case, Salim Tamari was right. We need to be very careful to avoid expansionistic tendency of the definitory ambition of populism and to be always selective. Having said so, the question remains very close to me, very important to me, that first, populism is always possible because democracy is a movement of contestation on the representation of the people, always. So if you have parties, organized parties, this is less possible. If these parties are liquid and are in decline, of course, there is the possibility of the audience to be captured by an emerging leader or an emerging movement or whatever. So this has to do with the famous gap I mentioned. So if this gap between inside and outside the state is empty of important political organizations, of course, the possibility for the circulation of elite and the stabilization of a new populist elite is more capable of doing, more easy to do. So that, in my view, these are specifications that needs to be added to the definition if we want to have a definition of populism, at least a minimal one. So without abusing my time, this is what I wanted to say. Thank you, Lana.
Thank you very much. I have a question from the chat room. We have actually just about 6 minutes left, so I will ask this and then maybe take another one from the audience. This is from, yes, Nahi, do you want to say something? From Khalid Hroub, Professor Hroub sent a note along the same lines of definition. He says, the more I listen to and read about populism, the more confused I become. about the concept and particularly its relevance to today's Arab debates. I think we use the term differently in Arab discussions, more as a form of a demagogy discourse used by regimes and their opponents in non-democratic systems. All what we have heard is debates that suggest a democratic setting one way or another. My question to the panelists is, what forms of populism do we have in non-democracies? Okay, so here's a question, and shall we take, Nahed, would you like to make another comment, please?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it is also tied to Al-Hroub's question. So, and my question is, if we don't really have a democratic government, but you have the people as introduced to democratic sentiments in the process of democratization. So in that sense, would the idea of populism and the concept be viable to non-democratic countries? And I guess my other question is in relation to the people. So if we have a homogenized pool, then most likely we won't really see the problems of populism. I mean, you might touch upon the language, but it's not there unless there is this contrast tension in the idea of the people.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I invite Hunaida Ghanem to make a comment? Because among the speakers, she's the only one who did not respond. This is your big chance to elaborate what you were saying at the end.
شكرا كثير. مزبوط. أنا في واحدة من يعني الملاحظات اللي مستر أندرو حسيت إنه واو قديش هيك ريليفانت لكل النقاش لما بدنا نناقش فلسطين، إنه طب إيش اسمها هي فلسطين ولا إسرائيل؟ عمليا هي هيك بقلب لب الصراع، مش بس قلب لب الصراع، بعملية خلينا نقول ديناميكية مشروع الاستعمار الاستيطاني بأصله، في إنه إزاحة مستمرة لفلسطين ومحو هو إحلال إسرائيل قدامها. عشان هيك واحدة من الصراعات اللي إحنا بنواجهها في ظل إنه إحنا عم بنعيش عملية الصراع هاي، هي عملية هاي البريزنس تبعنا، الوجود، اللغة اللي إحنا نستخدمها، لأنه كل كلمة بتقولها هي جزء من عملية بتحس الممارسة تبعت الصراع في لحظة معينة. الفكرة إنه واحدة من الأمور اللي بتتعلق خلينا نقول ديناميكية الشعبوية في إسرائيل وبتطورها، إنه في ظل وجود مشروع استعماري وبشكل خاص في ظل وجود يعني المشروع مفتوح، المشروع الخاص فيه المشروع بإسرائيل إنه هو مفتوح، بمعنى ما حدا لا بيعرف حدود ولا بيعرف وين رايحين ولا بيعرف إلى آخره. وكل المحاولات إنه تسكينه مثلا إنك تقول هاي دولة القومية للشعب اليهودي نقطة، مع إنه الحدود لساتها مفتوحة، في ظل إنه المشروع مفتوح، في ظل حالة الصراع الأوبن إند هاي وحالة الصراع المستمر، الديناميكية الخاصة اللي صارت إنه في القيم الأساسية ما في صراع بين اليمين الجديد مثلا واليمين التقليدي. يمكن في صراع بمعنى معين، يمكن شيء هيك شوي حتى يستغرب إنه مثلا اليمين الكلاسيكي كان من ناحية التريتوري أكثر أرض بروح باتجاه اليمين الشعبوي. اليوم مفهومه لأرض إسرائيل هو مفهوم أقل من المفهوم التقليدي اللي حطه جابوتينسكي بالبدايات، اللي كان الأردن مع فلسطين، فهو تقلص إلى حد معين، ثم تقلص أكثر لما صار في قبول لأنه يكون في نوع من الحكم الذاتي الفلسطيني اللي موجود بمحلات معينة. فهي كمان إنه بالكور بالآخر في حالة الصراع اللي إحنا موجودين فيها، الإمباكت هو يعني في النهاية ما بيأثر إلا من اتجاه إنه تحول اليمين الرسمي اللي بشكل الدولانية الاستاتيزم بلغة علم الاجتماع، تحول كأنه لمصدر للعقلانية، يعني يمثل العقلانية. من ناحية المشروع هو نفس المشروع السياسي، هو مشروع مستمر في تحويل الوضع اللي احنا موجودين فيه، حالة أبارتهايد بشكل أو بآخر، من ديفاكتو لديجوري. ولكن المشروع الشعبوي يبدو كأنه مجنون، كأنه فيش له حدود، كأنه سيذهب بنا إلى الحافة. فالوضع اللي وصلنا له اليوم وهذه الخطورة اللي موجودة، إنه المجتمع الدولي بده تمنتين بإبقاء هذا اليمين الرسمي اللي بيمثل القيم اللي حطها المشروع اللي حطه نتنياهو اكشولي، بس بده اياه يضل موجود، يكمل الاستيطان، يكمل ايش ما كان، لانه ما بده يحرجه، لانه ممكن ينهزم وينكسر ويرجع هذا اليمين الشعبوي اللي مخوف اكثر. فحطنا في ازمه حقيقيه، يعني حقيقيه جدا، انه بين هذا الجنون وبين بين الكولونياليه بين الاستعمار الاستيطاني العقلاني وبين الاستعمار الاستيطاني الشعبوي اللي بيستعمل الاستراتيجية الشعبوية، انه احنا بدنا نروح على هذا لانه احنا بنقدر نحكي معه اكثر. فهذه واحدة من يعني الأزمة الحقيقية اللي الآن موجود فيها الإرهاصات أو الشعب الفلسطيني.
معلش، بس أنا مش فاهمة النقطة من دكتور هنيدا لما بتقولي إنه populist، يعني إنه من أي ناحية؟ يعني هون ميزتي بين
من ناحية
الاثنين.
الاستراتيجيات الخطابية اللي بيستخدمها، من ناحية طلع يعني كل اليمين اللي مثله يمين الجديد، اللي خلينا نقول يمين اللي مثله نتنياهو كان قائده بالسنوات الأخيرة، من ناحية الاستراتيجيات الخطابية اللي بحده، من ناحية خطاب نحو من هو الشعب، مين إحنا الشعب، إحنا الشعب في مقابل النخب اللي هي عم بتحاول إنه خلينا نقول تمنع تنفيذ حكم الشعب والخيار الديمقراطي. هذا الادعاء الأساسي اللي موجود عنده، وبالتالي إنه هاي النخب عم تشتغل من خلال أذرع الدولة ومن خلال يعني القضاء بتلبيسه تهم اللي هي بس الهدف اللي لها تمنع وصوله للحكم وتعرقل حكم الشعب. هذا هو أساس خطابه. هلا اوكي،
بس بتخيليش انه عم بيستعملوا كمان هم نفس اللغة؟ يعني يا الحكم الجديد هلا اللي
لا
انت
على الإطلاق. الهدف
distinguishing.
الأساسي، النقطة الأساسية ناهد اللي بتميز هذا الحكم، أو خلينا نقول معارضين نتنياهو عن نتنياهو، هن متفقين سياسيين على أغلب النقاط. النقطة الأساسية اللي بيسموها بالعبراني المملختيوت، اللي هي الاستاتيزم اللي حاولت أحكي عنها، بمعنى إنه نتنياهو لقد يعني عمل على تآكل كل مصداقية مؤسسات الدولة وعلى تآكل مملختيوت الاستاتيزم اللي هو أسسوا بن غوريون. وبالتالي إحنا الهدف اللي لقينا إسا إن نعيد إنتاجه ونعيد ترميمه في قدام الهجمة اللي أدت إلى تهديمه نهائيا. هذه الأساس، إنه من جهة في عندك يمين تقريبا اليوم مجتمع على اللقات الأساسية اللي حطها نتنياهو باتجاه المسألة الفلسطينية، إنه الاستيطان الشرعي، إنه الاستيطان بقلب الكونسنسوس، إنه فيش شيء اسمه عودة لحدود 67، إنه القدس هي يعني عاصمة إسرائيل الأبدية. الأساس، الأسس الفكرية تبعت اليمين الموجودة هي الموجودة اليوم. نقطة النقاش الأساسية هي ترتبط بالشعبوية، بمعنى ادعاء نتنياهو إنه النخب تسعى إلى الانقلاب على إرادة الشعب من خلال تلبيسه تهم شو بسموها تجريمية، يعني 3 قضايا اللي هو إسا موجود قدام القضاء عليه، والادعاء إنه هذا تم التآمر عليه من أجل إسقاط رغبة الشعب. وبالتالي بالمقابل، وهذا اللي تم اتهامه إنه كل عمله هو الديليجيتيمايزيشن، ضرب مصداقية مؤسسات القضاء في الدولة إلى آخره، أدت إلى تآكل ما يسمى الاستاتيزم مؤسسات الدولة. وهذا اليمين المقابل اللي بقوده صاعر، هذا الحفيد تبع ما يسمى جابوتينسكي رمزيا، وأيضا اليمين الاستيطاني اللي بيحاول يكون هو على أساس أنه يمثل المؤسسة الاستابليشمنت الرسمية العقلانية، ولكنه يقود نفس المشروع.
شكرا يا هنيدة، شكرا. في شوية شعبوية في كلامك الأخير كان، وأنا بدي أستعمل صلاحيات الشعبوية عشان أنهي الحديث، لأنه في خوف إنه إذا استمرينا، أول شيء في كثير من الحاضرين يزهق، وهيك بنروح بنوع من الحماس وبننتقل إلى جلسة الغدا بعد الظهر اللي هي الجلسة الأخيرة. Thank you for your participation. I'm afraid the time has caught with us. It was a splendid debate. I thank you very much for your participation, and hopefully we will see you, at least some of you, tomorrow afternoon for the third and final day of discussion. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
And it would be great to see you at the round table. I think it would be a very exhilarating discussion. هنيدة راح تكوني